Morning light spread across the sea as Major Raymond Wilkins guided 8 B-25 bombers toward the enemy stronghold of Rabaul, and the clock showed 6:45 a.m. when the ground radar picked up their formation far out over the Solomon Sea and began warning every gun position waiting below. Wilkins was only 26, but this was his 87th combat mission, and he was the last surviving original pilot of the 3rd Bombardment Group, a fact that weighed heavily as he led his men toward the fortress beneath them. Nearly 400 Japanese fighters and more than 360 anti-aircraft guns guarded the harbor and surrounding ridges, making Rabaul the most dangerous target anywhere in the Pacific at that time. The briefing 3 hours earlier had taken place in a quiet open room where the crews listened with pale, strained faces as the intelligence officer described their objective. Simpson Harbor contained cruisers and destroyers that were supporting the enemy force at Bougainville, where American Marines had landed 2 days before, and those ships needed to remain trapped inside the harbor for the invasion to succeed. 5th Air Force needed to smash them before they sailed, and the officer who gave the briefing did not try to soften reality. He told the men plainly that some of them would not return. Wilkins knew that better than anyone. He had watched nearly all of his original squadron fall over the past 20 months. Some had burned over New Guinea, others had gone down into the Coral Sea, and a few had simply vanished on long missions that never reached their targets. When he arrived in early 1942, dozens of pilots stood alongside him. Now he was the only one still flying. He commanded 8 B-25s, heavily modified for low-level attack, and each one carried rows of forward-firing 50 caliber guns. The strategy was brutally simple: fly in at mast height only 50 to 100 feet over the water, skip bombs across the surface like stones, smash them into the sides of ships at anchor, rake their decks with gunfire until the bomb detonated, then race out before enemy fighters overwhelmed them. Intelligence reported that nearly 200 fighters were stationed at the base, plus more than 170 carrier aircraft arriving only the day before from the fleet, which meant Rabaul now had air strength equal to a floating fortress. As the formation crossed the Solomon, C. Wilkins checked his gauges. Fuel looked steady. Engines were running strong. His aircraft named Fifi carried 8 fixed guns, 4 in the nose, and 4 inside pods, giving it brutal firepower, able to send hundreds of rounds every second into any target. Crews had spent months figuring out how to fight in this low-level role, and most of the men who perfected the method were already dead. Early in 1943, engineers removed bombardier positions and replaced them with solid gun mounts. The new tactic required flying so low that enemy radar had almost no time to react while the bomb skipped across the surface into the hull of a ship. The survivors of those early attempts learned to trust speed, precision, and timing, and every mistake during testing had cost lives. Japanese radar detected the Americans at least 30 minutes before they arrived, which meant fighters would already be rising from multiple airfields, along with anti-aircraft teams, manning hundreds of gun positions around the harbor. Wilkins stayed low and fast. His formation followed tightly behind him. Men called Rabaul the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific because the volcanic ridges formed a natural bowl that protected a massive anchorage, and the Japanese had turned it into a fortress layered with bunkers, radar, and anti-aircraft positions that outnumbered those in both Darwin and Port Moresby. Combined, 5th Air Force regarded this target as the toughest of the entire campaign. Wilkins had survived this long by staying disciplined. Check the fuel, watch the temperatures, keep the radio quiet. Trust the wingmen. These rules had kept him alive since February 1942, but he also knew that luck never lasted forever. Even the best pilots eventually faced a mission that ended them. The coastline came into view ahead, dark jungle, rising above glowing blue water. Wilkins pushed his bomber down to about 100 feet until spray from the sea reached the windshield. The 7 B-25s behind him tightened formation, waiting for his signal. The broad opening of Simpson Harbor appeared as they swept in at low altitude, revealing warships tightly packed around piers. It was more enemy steel than Wilkins had seen in months. Then a heavy gun on the northern ridge, fired first, sending a black burst of smoke ahead of the formation. More guns opened. Wilkins dropped even lower, maybe 70 feet above the surface, and pushed the throttles forward as hundreds of guns locked on to 8 approaching bombers. He steadied the aircraft. His thumb hovered over the trigger. The first destroyer loomed ahead 600 yards away. In 90 seconds, everything about this mission would explode into chaos. At 500 yards, he opened fire. Streams of tracers shot forward. The 850s roared. Shell casings rattled across the cockpit floor. At 400 yards, the destroyer's deck erupted under the hail of bullets. At 300 yards, its guns fired back, sending bright lines of tracers into the air. The B-25 shuddered as enemy rounds tore through metal. At 200 yards, the bombs released and skipped across the water, 1-2 striking below the waterline. Wilkins pulled up as both explosions tore the destroyer open, and the real fight began. The destroyer split apart along its midsection as Wilkins climbed away, and the blast behind him sent smoke rolling across the harbor, while fragments of steel leapt into the air and splashed back down into the water. He felt immediately that something was wrong with the controls. The bomber responded slowly as if fighting him. He glanced toward the tail and saw that the vertical stabilizer was nearly gone, and the hydraulic lines had been ripped open, leaving a stream of fluid trailing behind the aircraft. The damaged tail pulled the B-25 to the right, forcing Wilkins to use every bit of strength in his arms to keep it level. Below and behind him, the battle intensified as the remaining 7 bombers followed their runs. 2 more destroyers were struck. A transport ship near the docks caught fire so violently that flames jumped above the superstructure. But the arrival of enemy fighters changed everything. Zeros from the carrier force swept in at low altitude, their engines screaming as they dove toward the bombers. Wilkins saw one B-25 erupt in flames after a burst of cannon fire tore through its fuel tanks. No parachutes appeared. The wreck fell straight into the harbor and disappeared in a boiling plume. Anti-aircraft fire grew even heavier. The Japanese had correctly predicted the route the American bombers would take to escape, and every gun around Simpson Harbor concentrated on the aircraft turning to withdraw. One bomber in the distance rolled over as if its wings had been cut off and smashed into the water in a burst of spray. Wilkins counted quickly. Including his own aircraft, 6 B-25s were still airborne. For the moment, both engines on his bomber continued to run, though the right one showed rising heat, and the left one flickered slightly, but nothing severe yet. The hydraulics were gone, which meant landing gear and flaps would have to be lowered manually if they survived the flight home. He checked the fuel through the shaking. The tanks seemed untouched, which was another small piece of luck reminding him that the mission was not yet lost. Ahead of him loomed a far larger threat, a heavy cruiser swinging its broadside into position. The cruiser was already firing at the retreating bombers, sending sheets of tracer fire into the sky. Wilkins had 2 choices: break away and head for safety, or turn in for another attack. His squadron was scattered, each bomber trying desperately to escape, and the cruiser could still bring its guns to bear on his wingmen. If those guns were not suppressed, more American aircraft would be torn from the sky. The easy choice was to withdraw. He had already completed his bombing run and destroyed 1 ship, even though his aircraft was nearly crippled. But the young co-pilot beside him, barely 3 missions into combat, looked at him waiting. Wilkins made his choice without speaking. He pushed the throttles forward and aimed the wounded B-25 toward the massive warship ahead. The co-pilot understood immediately that they had no bombs left. This would be a run made entirely with the forward guns, a pure sacrifice meant to draw fire from the squadron. The cruiser filled the windscreen from 800 yards as Wilkins dropped to barely 50 feet above the water, using rudder and engine power to fight the failing tail. The noise of tearing metal grew worse as the aircraft shook violently. At 600 yards, every anti-aircraft mount on the cruiser fired at once, sending walls of tracers into the air. It was more firepower than Wilkins had ever seen directed at a single aircraft. He flew straight into it. At 500 yards, the windshield shattered and glass sprayed across the cockpit. A searing bolt of pain tore through his left arm where a fragment struck him, but he held the trigger down with his good hand. The 8 guns roared non-stop, carving open the cruiser's deck. At 400 yards, the bomber seemed ready to break apart. Holes spread across both wings. The right engine sputtered. At 300 yards, the airframe groaned under impossible stress. But Wilkins kept firing, pouring a stream of bullets into the superstructure, where enemy gun crews sheltered. At 200 yards, the cruiser looked like a wall of steel and flame. Gun crews dove for cover or fell as rounds ripped through their positions. At 100 yards, Wilkins finally released the trigger and pulled back on the control column. The shattered stabilizer fought him. The bomber climbed by sheer force of engine power and cleared the top of the cruiser by barely 20 feet. Smoke poured from the right engine, oil pressure dropped to near zero, the cylinder temperature reached its maximum, but the cruiser had stopped firing at the other bombers. All of its guns had focused on Wilkins, drawing the danger away from his squadron. As he banked away, the right engine seized and stopped spinning. He feathered it immediately to reduce drag and turned toward the harbor exit. He now flew a crippled single-engine bomber over enemy water with dozens of fighters closing in. 3 Zeros pounced first, diving from above with perfect speed and angle. His top turret gunner fired upward and sent tracers climbing. The fighters split into separate attack paths. One dived straight down the center, and its cannon shells hammered the fuselage, ripping open the radio compartment. A scream burst through the intercom, then silence as the radio operator went down. The Zero swept past and climbed away. More Zeros closed in, 4, then 6, then 8. The entire air group had locked onto the single wounded bomber. Wilkins could not outrun them, could not turn, could only hold his course and fight. Another fighter came in from the left. The waist gunner fired a long burst and sparks jumped from the attacker's wing root. But the Japanese pilot pressed forward and sent 20mm rounds through the left wing. Fuel spilled out in a bright stream. One burning tracer could ignite the entire wing. Wilkins pushed the nose down to gain speed, even though it brought him closer to the guns on shore. He had no good choices. Behind him, the coastline rushed past as he aimed for open water. The bomber's guns grew quiet as ammunition ran low. The remaining engine coughed, then steadied. The fuel leak worsened. The cockpit filled with the smell of gasoline. The gauges screamed warnings. Yet Wilkins continued trying to get clear of the harbor. He held the bomber level as the sea opened before them, and the Japanese fighters circled for the final kill. The top turret gunner shouted that he had hit the Zero, but the fighter kept flying as if nothing could stop it, and it rose for another attack, while more Japanese aircraft joined in, until the sky behind Wilkins was filled with enemies. 4 fighters became 6, then 8, and more circled beyond them, waiting their turn. The carrier air groups had finally found their wounded target, and a single crippled B-25 could not hope to escape so many opponents. Wilkins pushed the remaining engine to full power, but the damaged airframe dragged like an anchor, and every second the bomber lost more speed. Another Zero swept in from the left side, and the waist gunner fired short controlled bursts, until sparks jumped from the attacker's wing root. Yet the Japanese pilot did not break away, and his 20mm shells walked across the B-25's left wing, tearing open a fuel tank. A stream of gasoline sprayed backward over the fuselage, and Wilkins knew one tracer could ignite the aircraft instantly. He dropped the nose to gain what little speed he could, though it brought him dangerously close to the anti-aircraft guns on the shoreline. The harbor exit lay ahead 2 miles away, but the fighters closed quickly, firing from multiple angles. The waist gunner kept shooting, though each burst grew shorter and weaker as ammunition dwindled. Another Zero slid in behind the bomber, and the last rounds from the top turret reached upward, then stopped entirely, meaning the gunner was either out of ammunition or dead at his station. The coastline gave way to open water, but Japanese fighters continued attacking with ruthless precision. One fighter struck the rudder, another chewed away the left aileron, and the B-25 began to fly more like broken metal than a proper aircraft. Wilkins checked the instruments and saw the remaining engine struggling with fuel pressure, fluctuating violently, and oil temperature climbing higher each second. The shredded wing created uneven lift, and he used rudder and throttle to fight the tilt. Though every control input demanded strength, he was rapidly losing. His wounded arm throbbed, and warm blood soaked his sleeve, dripping onto the floor. The co-pilot tried to assist, but the controls were so heavy that both men together could barely hold the bomber steady. Below them, waves rolled dark blue and green under the sunlight as the bomber limped forward. The fighters struck again, this time from 3 directions. Bullets shattered the fuselage, and one burst of cannon fire tore open the radio compartment even further. The smell of gasoline thickened, and the cockpit grew hazy with fumes and smoke. The gauges flashed warnings for hydraulic failure, electrical overload, and dropping oil pressure. Wilkins saw the truth in a single glance. The aircraft would not hold together much longer. He knew they were still 50 miles from friendly territory, and even if the engine lasted, they would never outrun the fighters. The time for choices was over. The bomber shook violently, then the engine gave a final cough and went silent, leaving only the rush of wind over the torn surfaces. The propeller windmilled freely, offering no power at all. The B-25 began dropping immediately. Wilkins trimmed the aircraft for the best glide speed, hoping to gain a few extra miles before impact. The Japanese fighters still fired for a few moments, either unaware that the bomber was finished or unwilling to let their prey fall without one last attack. Cannon fire ripped through the fuselage again, and the waist gunner stopped responding. Wilkins guessed he was gone. He pressed the intercom and ordered the co-pilot to prepare for a water landing flaps up and hit the swells parallel. The co-pilot acknowledged in a strained voice. The bomber descended toward the sea, the waves rising quickly. The altimeter needle swept downward. 500 feet, then 300, then 100. Wilkins focused entirely on holding the aircraft level. The tail was barely attached, and the shredded wings shook so hard he feared they might tear away. The fighters pulled off their attack now that the bomber was near the water. Maybe they believed it would finish itself without help. The surface rushed upward. The Pacific stretched wide and indifferent. The B-25 struck at 90 knots, the nose digging into the water. A wall of green and white slammed into the cockpit. The force hurled Wilkins against his harness, and twisted metal screeched around him as the bomber crumpled. Water surged over the windshield and poured into the cockpit, filling it almost instantly. The aircraft slewed sideways and broke open along its seams. The cockpit darkened as seawater swallowed the instrument panel. Wilkins unbuckled his harness, but his left arm refused to move, and pain flooded his body. The co-pilot struggled beside him, blood streaming down his face. The water climbed to their chests, then to their necks. Wilkins reached for the overhead escape hatch, but the frame was bent. He yanked with his good arm, but it would not open. The co-pilot moved toward it, using both hands, pulling with desperation. It shifted, but not enough. The bomber tilted nose down, and the water rose. They had seconds before the plane sank entirely. Wilkins braced himself, using his legs for leverage, and pulled again with everything he had. Metal groaned, and suddenly the hatch gave way, exploding open as a flood of water rushed through the opening. The co-pilot scrambled up, first disappearing into the daylight above. Wilkins tried to follow, but the bomber lurched violently and threw him back into the water-filled cockpit. He fought upward in the dark, using touch rather than sight, feeling only cold pressure and chaos. His lungs burned for air. He kicked and reached the opening again just as the cockpit filled completely. One more push and he broke into open sunlight, gasping desperately. The co-pilot floated only a few feet away. Behind them, the B-25 stood nearly vertical, with its tail pointing skyward. For a moment, it hung there, suspended by pockets of trapped air, then slipped beneath the surface, leaving only a trail of bubbles marking its grave. The last aircraft of the original 3rd Bombardment Group was gone forever. The co-pilot splashed toward Wilkins as the Major surfaced, struggling to stay afloat with one functioning arm, while blood flowed freely from the wound that had torn into him during the attack and stained the surrounding water a dark red. The ocean rocked them gently, but without mercy, and each small wave felt like a weight trying to drag them under. Wilkins kicked weakly, trying to keep his head above the surface, but his strength was fading quickly, and his injured arm hung useless at his side. The co-pilot called his name, but Wilkins barely heard him as everything around him blurred and dimmed. Behind them, the last fragments of the B-25 slipped beneath the Pacific, leaving only a few bubbles on the surface before vanishing forever. The sky above remained clear except for the distant circles of Japanese fighters still watching. 1-0 broke formation and glided low above the two struggling airmen. Wilkins braced for the burst of gunfire that would finish them, but it never came. Instead, the fighter pilot dipped his wings in a slow, deliberate gesture before turning back toward Rabaul as if acknowledging an opponent who had fought beyond any reasonable limit. Soon the sky emptied entirely, leaving only Wilkins and the co-pilot alone in the wide, endless sea. The co-pilot held Wilkins tightly to keep him from sinking, but the Major drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to respond to the younger man's frantic attempts to keep him alert. They had no raft, no supplies, no rescue signal, and were nearly 50 miles from friendly territory with no guarantee that anyone even knew they were alive. The ocean currents pulled at them, and Wilkins' weight made it harder for the co-pilot to stay above the surface. Minutes stretched into long, unbearable moments as Wilkins fought simply to breathe. The wound in his arm bled steadily, and the salt water made every part of him burn. The co-pilot encouraged him, begged him to stay awake, but Wilkins could not answer. His vision flickered between light and darkness, the sun overhead fading and returning in broken patches. The reality settled on the co-pilot with crushing force. They were alone in the vast Pacific with no sign of help. The fighters were gone. The bombers that survived had already cleared the harbor and headed for New Guinea. No one could circle back. No one could risk returning for survivors this deep in enemy waters. Wilkins drifted lower in the water, and the co-pilot pulled him up again, struggling with exhaustion. The Major's skin had turned pale. His eyes barely opened. It was clear the blood loss was draining the life from him minute by minute. The co-pilot tried to hold him up, but the weight grew heavier as Wilkins' strength left him entirely. The water splashed against their faces. The sun rose higher overhead, burning down with intensity. Their legs kicked constantly to stay afloat. 40 minutes, maybe less, that was the limit of what the co-pilot could manage, carrying the full weight of a grown man in full flight gear while his own strength drained away. He tried to adjust his grip, shifting Wilkins' head above the waves, but each attempt became harder than the last. Wilkins finally whispered something that the co-pilot could not hear clearly, and then his head sagged forward. His breathing slowed. The co-pilot realized the moment had come when he could no longer hold both of them above water. If he kept holding the Major, he would drown too, and instinct forced him to make the hardest decision he would ever face. His arms trembled. His breath tore from his chest. He tried one last time to lift Wilkins higher, but the weight pulled them both downward. He had to choose. He let go. Wilkins slipped beneath the surface, slowly drifting downward as if carried by unseen hands. The co-pilot cried out and reached for him, but the Major sank too quickly for him to catch. The ocean closed over Wilkins, and he disappeared below the waves without a sound. The Pacific claimed him, and he never resurfaced again. The co-pilot remained afloat, barely conscious, fighting just to keep his head above the water. Hours passed. The sun scorched him. His limbs grew numb. He drifted with the currents until exhaustion overtook him. He would later wake aboard a U.S. Navy patrol boat that had found him 3 days later, burned, dehydrated, and delirious but alive. When he recovered, he told the story of Wilkins' final minutes, the courage, the decision to attack the cruiser, the struggle to ditch the bomber, and the impossible sacrifice in the water. His testimony would enter official records, shaping how the world learned of Wilkins' final mission. Meanwhile, the remaining B-25s were still fighting to escape the chaos around Simpson Harbor. 5 aircraft from Wilkins' squadron managed to reach Allied airspace by 10:30 that morning. Some were trailing smoke, others missing parts of their tails or wings, and one flew on a single functioning engine. When they landed, the ground crews stared in disbelief at the number of holes punched through the airframes, more than 300 in one bomber alone. Medics rushed out, pulling wounded men from the turrets and waist positions. The survivors were silent, unable to process the chaos they had endured. Intelligence officers began their debrief, immediately asking for damage reports and strike confirmations. The mission's purpose had been clear: keep the Japanese ships pinned inside Simpson Harbor and prevent them from threatening the American landings at Bougainville. Every detail mattered. The crews reported what they had seen: destroyers, broken apart transport ships, burning massive explosions along the docks, and the heavy cruiser struck repeatedly and forced to halt its firing. As they spoke, one question hung over everyone. Would any of the men who had gone down over the harbor return? Would Wilkins come back, or had the ocean taken him forever? The crews described the battle with calm precision despite the shock still in their faces, and confirmed that Wilkins had destroyed a destroyer with a direct skip-bomb strike, then damaged the heavy cruiser until its guns fell silent while other ships burned across the harbor, including another destroyer that split apart and a transport vessel consumed at the docks as ammunition stores erupted inside it. The debriefing officers wrote quickly, building a picture of the devastation inside Simpson Harbor. 8 B-25s had been shot down. 9 P-38 fighters from the escort force were lost. 45 American airmen were dead or missing. It was the bloodiest day 5th Air Force had suffered in the Southwest Pacific campaign, but the mission had accomplished its purpose. The Japanese fleet at Rabaul never attempted to sortie against the American Marines landing at Bougainville. The bombers had held the enemy in place. The beachhead remained secure. The invasion continued without a single enemy cruiser or destroyer breaking free to attack. The numbers on paper told one story: tactical success bought with staggering loss. Yet another story waited among the returning crews, a story from a different squadron of the same 3rd Bombardment Group, a story that would surface years later. Sergeant Dick Walker flew with the 13th Bombardment Squadron, and his experience on the same morning revealed something dark about command under fire. Walker's flight approached Rabaul from an alternate route, 8 B-25s, flying in formation and facing the same wall of guns and fighters as Wilkins' group. When they reached the harbor entrance, enemy fire opened instantly, streaking across the air in lines of white and red. Fighters were already climbing. The moment for attack had arrived. The squadron commander should have led the charge. Instead, at the last possible second, he broke formation, turned away, and began flying back toward New Guinea, leaving his men without direction. Radio discipline prevented anyone from challenging him, so 7 bombers simply followed his lead without knowing why their attack had been abandoned. Walker felt fury rising as he saw the harbor full of Targ, yet watched his squadron turn from the fight. Something inside him refused to accept it. Breaking radio silence only in his own heart, he pulled away from the others, rolled his bomber into a steep turn, and dove alone toward Simpson Harbor. 1 B-25 against 360 anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of fighters. It was insanity, but Walker pushed in at mast height, picking a large merchant vessel as his target. Enemy fire was even worse than the briefing had warned. Shell bursts filled the sky and tracers stitched across every inch of air around him. Rounds smashed into the wing's fuselage and tail. The bomber shook violently. At 500 yards he opened fire. At 400 yards his guns tore the deck apart. At 300 yards his windshield filled with smoke and debris as crews tried desperately to fight him off. At 200 yards he released both bombs. They skipped perfectly across the water, slammed into the hull, and exploded deep within the ship. The merchant vessel buckled and began listing heavily. Walker pulled up and roared away as fighters dove after him. 6 or 8 or maybe 10 he could not count. His gunners fired back, burning through ammunition. The aircraft took more hits but remained airborne. Somehow Walker threaded through the chaos and escaped the harbor alone and alive. He landed at Dobajora 90 minutes after Wilkins went down. His aircraft had 43 holes in it, but his crew suffered only minor injuries. They climbed out furious that their commander had turned back without explanation. That confrontation happened later that day. Walker and several airmen demanded answers. The commander offered excuses talking about weather and tactical assessment, but nobody believed him. The operations officer supported him, and both men seemed more concerned with their reputations than the squadron's honor. 5th Air Force handled the issue quietly and removed both officers by ordering them back to the United States. No court, martial, no public explanation, just reassignment. So the squadron could continue without the weight of failed leadership. The incident remained hidden in classified files for decades. Meanwhile, over Rabaul, the fighting continued beyond Wilkins' group and beyond Walker. The main raid involved 72 B-25s attacking from multiple directions. The defenders struggled to respond to so many simultaneous threats. With anti-aircraft positions already firing at full capacity and fighters busy chasing retreating bombers, it became impossible to defend every ship. The Americans pressed advantage after advantage. Another B-25 went down at 11:15. Another at 11:23. Overhead P-38 fighters tangled with Zeros in twisting combat. 2 Lightnings exploded. 1 Zero spiraled into the harbor and vanished beneath the smoke. The battle lasted almost 90 minutes before the final American aircraft broke away and headed for home. Casualties mounted on both sides. The cost was brutal, but the effect could not be denied. The Japanese fleet remained bottled inside the harbor. Their cruisers and destroyers could not risk breaking through the chaos of smoke, burning fuel, and still descending bombs. The Marines at Bougainville would never face a naval bombardment because of what happened on that morning. 5th Air Force had paid dearly for that outcome, yet without it the invasion might have collapsed. As fuel drained from returning B-25s and the last surviving crews counted holes in their wings, another question remained. Would the sacrifice of so many men be remembered? Or would the chaos of war swallow their names? For now, the only thing that mattered was that the fleet at Rabaul had been stopped, and the Marines on Bougainville owed their survival to the men who had fought and died over Simpson Harbor, and among those men none fought harder or gave more than Major Raymond Harrell Wilkins. Within 48 hours, the results of the raid became unmistakable, and every piece of intelligence that filtered through confirmed that the sacrifice of 45 airmen had achieved exactly what 5th Air Force needed. Japanese naval forces at Rabaul did not attempt a single sortie toward Bougainville. Not one cruiser, not one destroyer, not one transport. The harbor remained silent except for repair crews struggling to control the damage left behind. Reports sent to Imperial Navy headquarters at Truk described the November 2nd attack as the most destructive air assault Rabaul had ever experienced. 7 ships were confirmed either destroyed or crippled beyond immediate use, and the harbor defenses had been shaken so deeply that many crewmen feared another low-level strike might come at any hour. Even the elite carrier air groups from Zuikaku, Shikaku, and Zuiho suffered heavy losses. 18 Zeros were destroyed outright. 12 more were damaged beyond repair. Their pilots were experienced men trained before the war during a time when Japan still possessed a deep reservoir of aviation talent. By late 1943, such pilots were irreplaceable. Each loss mattered. American codebreakers intercepted messages in the days that followed, and the tone of the Japanese transmissions revealed a shift in confidence. They no longer believed Rabaul safe for major fleet operations. By November 10th, the carrier groups had already withdrawn back toward Truk, leaving behind only local defense aircraft and reduced offensive capability. Rabaul still stood as a fortress, but the threat it once posed had been permanently broken. Meanwhile on Bougainville, the Marines expanded their perimeter steadily, Supplies moved ashore without interruption. Artillery and tanks arrived safely. The beachhead grew stronger each day. No heavy cruisers shelled their positions. No destroyers attempted night attacks. No transport convoys were lost at sea. The invasion succeeded because the enemy fleet remained trapped in that harbor, battered and burning. Cold military mathematics recorded it simply. 45 airmen killed, 7 ships destroyed or disabled, 1 major Japanese base rendered ineffective. Strategic objectives achieved, but behind the arithmetic were names and faces that vanished in the smoke above Simpson Harbor. Men who had families waiting, men who had written letters home only days before, men whose luck ran out on a mission that demanded everything from them. Among these names, one soon stood apart. 5th Air Force began formal review of Major Wilkins' actions almost immediately. Witness statements from surviving pilots described his attacks in detail. They confirmed he destroyed a destroyer with perfect precision. They confirmed he turned toward the heavy cruiser even after catastrophic damage. They confirmed he drew all enemy fire away from the retreating squadrons and that the cruiser stopped firing on the fleeing bombers because its gun crews were focused entirely on surviving his strafing run. They confirmed he kept flying a dying aircraft long enough for 5 B-25s to clear the harbor. In military terms, every requirement for the Medal of Honor was met. Conspicuous gallantry, risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, direct and decisive action in the face of overwhelming enemy force. His squadron commander submitted the formal recommendation on November 5th. Supporting witness accounts followed within days. The paperwork traveled upward from group level to wing level, then to 5th Air Force headquarters. General George Kenney, commander of all Allied air operations in the Southwest Pacific, reviewed the recommendation personally. Kenney had seen many nominations, but few matched the clarity and overwhelming evidence contained in the Wilkins report. He approved it on November 20th and forwarded it to Washington. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall reviewed the case in December and agreed without hesitation. The final approval came from President Roosevelt in January 1944. From that moment, Raymond Harold Wilkins became one of the Pacific War's most honored combat pilots, though he himself never knew the recognition that awaited him. His family received a telegram in February notifying them of his death. The Medal of Honor itself arrived later during a ceremony in California. His parents accepted it with quiet grief, and his younger brother stood beside them. One person was not invited, the girl in Australia whom Wilkins had planned to marry. She learned of his death through unofficial channels, then received a final letter from him weeks later, a letter he had written before the mission describing hopes for the future hopes that would never happen. Back in the Southwest Pacific, the war moved forward relentlessly. 5th Air Force launched another raid on Rabaul on November 5th, then again on November 11th, but none matched the scale of the November 2nd attack. Defenses had been strengthened, radar coverage improved, more guns installed. Yet something fundamental had changed. The airmen now knew that the fortress could be struck hard and that low-level skip bombing truly worked. Morale rose despite the losses because the men believed in the tactic they had paid so much to perfect. The November 2nd raid became legend inside the bomb groups. Training manuals incorporated the lessons learned. Every new B-25 crew arriving in theater studied photographs of Wilkins' aircraft, studied the attack diagrams, studied the method he died proving. Low-level skip bombing became standard doctrine across the Southwest Pacific. Mechanics began reinforcing noses and expanding gun mounts based on combat experience drawn from Wilkins' squadron. By late 1943, most B-25s in the region carried similar firepower. Dick Walker continued flying missions, completing his tour and returning home a survivor of one of the most violent days in 5th Air Force history. Other crews rotated out. New replacements took their place. They learned about Wilkins during their orientation. His story became a touchstone, a reminder of what duty and sacrifice looked like. The 3rd Bombardment Group later received a Distinguished Unit citation for its role in the attack. Every man who participated, living or dead, was entitled to wear it. Yet no ribbon, no medal, no report could fully capture the chaos and courage of that mission or the price paid by those who never returned. The Distinguished Unit Citation recorded the mission in precise official language, listing the target, the opposition, the damage inflicted, and the casualties endured, but the formal tone could never capture the chaos that tore through the sky over Simpson Harbor or the fear and determination that lived inside every man who flew that day. Official records made the battle appear clean and calculated, while the truth had been smoke fire screams and shattered aircraft falling into the sea. Still, the question lingered whether the sacrifice of Major Wilkins and the others would be remembered beyond the military files, and the medals eventually stored in display cases, or whether history would allow their stories to fade into statistics among the countless losses of the Second World War. At first, the answer seemed uncertain. Their deeds appeared mostly as short mentions in Pacific War histories or as footnotes inside Air Force studies, but the lessons of the raid moved quickly through the ranks. Skip bombing became standard doctrine by December 1943, and training units across the Pacific taught the technique to every incoming crew. Mechanics began reinforcing noses, adding armor, and installing the heavier gun configurations that Wilkins' aircraft had carried into battle. Engineers refined attack angles and approach altitudes, discovering that 50 feet offered the most effective balance between accuracy and survivability, while 40 feet was too low and routinely resulted in wave spray blinding the pilots. The men who survived the November 2nd raid passed down everything they knew to younger crews' knowledge bought with blood. Rabaul remained a target into early 1944, though the character of the campaign changed as the Japanese pulled their heavy ships out and relocated major fleet units to safer waters around Truk. The fortress of Rabaul still housed thousands of troops, but its offensive value had been cracked beyond repair. American strategy shifted. Rather than assault the stronghold, directly commanders chose to isolate it. Supply lines were cut, airfields were destroyed. Submarines became the only consistent method the Japanese had to move supplies into the garrison. Slowly, the once mighty base became a prison. Meanwhile, the 3rd Bombardment Group continued flying missions until 1945. None of the original airmen remained. Wilkins had been the last of them. His death closed a chapter that had begun in early 1942, when the group first arrived in Australia with outdated aircraft and little experience. Every man who came after was a replacement stepping into a legacy shaped by sacrifices of those who never made it home. The B-25 itself grew into one of the most widely used bombers of the war, with nearly 10,000 built and operating in every theater. Later models included improvements drawn from combat reports, including strengthened noses, modified gun placements, and improved armor. Much of this stemmed from what had been learned during the brutal months of low-level attack operations in the Southwest Pacific. Wilkins' family kept his memory close and private. They did not seek public attention. They displayed his Medal of Honor at home along with photographs, letters, and the uniform he wore before deployment. His parents grew older carrying the burden of losing a son, a wound that time never truly healed. After they passed, his youngest brother inherited the collection before eventually donating it to the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The display is modest, only a single case among hundreds, showing his medal, a portrait of him in uniform, and a brief summary of the November 2nd mission. Most visitors walk past without knowing the depth of what happened that day. Veterans of the 3rd Bombardment Group held reunions in the decades following the war. In the 1950s, the gatherings were large, filled with stories, laughter, and quiet moments for the men who had not returned. By the 1970s, the groups grew smaller as age thinned their ranks. Wilkins' name was always spoken. A glass was raised, a moment of silence held. Eventually, too few remained to carry on the tradition. Dick Walker attended several of the reunions and told his own story, the one about the commander who turned back, the one about going in alone, and the one about watching Wilkins attack the cruiser with a burning shot-up aircraft. Walker passed away in 1998 at 76 years old, and his obituary mentioned his service only briefly without detail. The co-pilot who survived the ditching never spoke publicly about the mission again. He left the Air Force after the war, became a teacher, and raised a family. When students asked about his service, he kept it short, saying only that he flew in the Pacific. The memory remained locked inside him until his death in 2003. Across the ocean, the girl Wilkins planned to marry built a new life, eventually marrying someone else and raising children. But she kept the letters he had written before the mission letters, filled with talk of medical school dreams, of returning to Australia and building a future together. The last letter arrived in January 1944, weeks after she already knew he was gone. Among her belongings, her children later found a letter written on October 28th, only 4 days before the raid. In it, Wilkins wrote about a feeling that his luck was running out. He knew the statistics. He knew no pilot survived forever. Yet he also wrote about duty and about finishing the job no matter the cost. He promised that if he reached his 100th mission, he would request reassignment and come back to her. He never made it to Mission 88. Today, modern Air Force officers study the Rabaul raids as case studies in leadership innovation and risk. The analysis is clinical, aiming to extract lessons without emotion. Charts and diagrams show what happened, but they cannot capture what it meant. Future generations might never fully understand what the men of the 3rd Bombardment Group endured or what it cost them. But the truth remains, the statistics tell only a fraction of the story. 7 ships destroyed or damaged, Japanese naval operations halted, Bougainville invasion protected. Beneath those numbers lie lives and choices, stories of courage and fear and sacrifice. None greater than the one made by Major Raymond Harold Wilkins, who turned a dying bomber toward a cruiser, and in doing so saved an entire squadron at the cost of his own life. Strategic reports declared the mission successful, stating that 7 Japanese ships were destroyed or crippled, and that 45 American airmen were killed, losses considered acceptable by wartime calculations. But those numbers could never reflect the human cost or the individual lives behind each statistic. Raymond Harold Wilkins was only 26 years old when he died and had survived 86 missions when most crews never lived past 20. He was planning a future beyond the war, thinking of medical school, thinking of marriage, thinking of a life that stretched beyond the cockpit of a B-25. Yet he gave all of that up in the final seconds above Simpson Harbor, when he turned his shattered aircraft back toward the cruiser. The decision was not complicated to him. The squadron was withdrawing. The cruiser was preparing to fire again. Someone had to stop it. He could have kept flying. No one would have blamed him. His aircraft was already half destroyed, and the mission was technically complete. Protocol demanded withdrawal. Survival demanded withdrawal. But 5 B-25s were still climbing out of the harbor, and the cruiser's guns could tear them from the sky. Wilkins understood the choice in a single clear moment. 1 aircraft against 5, 1 life against 25 others. The decision that defines a Medal of Honor is rarely dramatic in the moment. It is simply a choice to value others above oneself, a choice that defies instinct and embraces duty even when death is certain. Wilkins made that choice at 800 yards from a Japanese cruiser. He pushed the throttles forward on an aircraft that was already dying, flew straight into a storm of gunfire, and drew every enemy weapon onto himself. Those few seconds bought the other crews the time they needed to escape. Because of him, 25 men lived and went on to build entire futures, raising families, working careers, growing old. 1 pilot named his son Raymond. Another kept a picture of Wilkins in his flight log for 40 years. Another visited his parents in California after the war and told them in quiet, steady words that their son had saved his life and the lives of the others. The tactic Wilkins used became standard practice throughout the Pacific. Skip bombing at mast height changed the way American forces attacked ships, and thousands of missions employed the same method, perfected under fire by men like Wilkins. From Rabaul to the Philippines, from New Guinea to Okinawa, B-25s flew at terrifyingly low altitudes, skipping bombs across the water into enemy hulls. Each successful strike carried the legacy of the men who proved the tactic worked. The aircraft Wilkins flew, the one nicknamed Fifi, now rests somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, 50 miles from Rabaul. Its aluminum long dissolved, and its steel bones softened by decades of salt and pressure. Yet its legacy remains far more solid than any wreckage. It destroyed 2 ships and saved a squadron. Few aircraft in the war left a greater impact. Across the ocean, the woman in Australia eventually forgave Wilkins for not returning, though the wound never fully healed. She rebuilt her life, married and raised children, but she kept every letter he sent. She would read them in quiet moments, remembering a future that once seemed certain. She held on to the last letter he wrote, the one that arrived after word of his death. Time softened her grief, but never erased it. His parents lived the rest of their days carrying the weight of losing a son, a pain that no medal or ceremony could mend. They displayed his Medal of Honor with pride, but pride did not replace their child. They lived 2 more decades with that absence beside them. Wilkins' 87 missions now stand as 87 times death came close, but did not claim him, and the 88th mission became the one the war demanded. Combat pilots understood the mathematics of survival. Fly enough missions, and eventually the odds catch up. No one escapes forever. Wilkins lasted longer than most, and he felt the truth of that in the days before the mission, writing it plainly in his final letters. Yet despite knowing the danger, he climbed into his aircraft again because someone had to lead. That is the heart of the story, not the ships sunk, or the tactics refined, or the strategic objectives achieved. The heart of the story is a young man who refused to turn away when others needed him. It is the story of a pilot who pushed a dying bomber toward a cruiser because his squadron had no chance otherwise. It is the story of courage that endures not because it is written in history books, but because it was lived in the span of seconds by men who understood what the moment demanded. On November 2nd, 1943, Major Raymond Harold Wilkins died in the Pacific after sinking 2 ships, then saving his squadron. He was 26 years old, the last survivor of the original 3rd Bombardment Group, and a hero whose courage carried forward far beyond the waters where he fell. His sacrifice was not simply a statistic. It was a life given so that others could keep theirs, a choice made in the face of impossible odds, and that choice continues to echo in every telling of his story. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.